Good morning. The war in Ukraine has bled dry the arsenals of European countries who are now scrambling to find suppliers to replace the weapons they send to Ukraine, as well as to replenish the supplies needed for their own defense. Europe doesn't produce nearly enough to meet the battlefield demands of just Ukraine, let alone whatever they hope to have on reserve to meet their own, and so they're looking outside Europe to find supply. India is stepping in, and in the past 2 years, its armaments industry has boomed on exports to Europe. And India is planning to build munitions factories in Poland, Slovakia, and Estonia. India is positioning itself as a manufacturer of defense equipment. This is the standard that Europe is hoping to achieve: supply Ukraine and have enough on hand to maintain 30 days of high-intensity conflict. The Ukraine problem on its own is ugly enough. Ukraine needs over 2 million artillery shells a year. The Russian advantage is 3 to 1, and that's before a big increase in Russian production capacity for 2025. So the EU is looking for artillery shells from wherever they can get them. They want to buy 500,000 rounds of 155 millimeter and 300,000 rounds of 122 for $3.2 billion. We'll come back to some of those numbers later. This is the problem the NATO armies has. We cannot produce enough weapons to replace what the Ukrainians are tossing the Russians' way. Europe has no idea how to build munitions, and apparently Europe has no idea how much munitions cost. If they're serious about gearing up for this 30-day high-intensity war continent-wide, this number needs to be 100 times bigger. And that assumes that India is going to be building all of them at a third the cost what our own manufacturers do. And that's a big assumption anyway for another reason. The comparatively small volumes of what India is already doing is causing diplomatic problems for them in the BRICS bloc. The RIC in BRICS is Russia, India, and China, and India is clearly working at cross purposes with Russia here. India gets most of their oil from Russia, and 60% of India's advanced weapons come from Russia. Earlier last year came news that the artillery shells that India was building, notionally for the European Union, was being sent to the Ukraine to be used right away against Russian forces. In September, India pushed back on that part of it, saying it was speculation. India does admit that they are dramatically increasing weapons exports to the European Union because of the significant depletion of artillery shells in Europe. But the reason for this significant depletion is that Europe is sending them to the Ukraine. India's official position is that they do not supply weapons directly to either Ukraine or Russia. But Russia doesn't need nor want weapons from India, and the Europeans are just buying them and shipping them to Kiev today to be used tomorrow. India focuses on replenishing artillery shell stocks of European countries, ensuring that they have the necessary resources. But everyone knows that's not what Europe is really doing, and the Europeans themselves say so. Here, the EU wants India to be a source of artillery shells and small arms ammunition for Ukraine, now that the United States is stepping back. An EU diplomat says that India is not facing political divisions about its support for Ukraine, unlike what's going on in the United States, and Indian production lines are already up and running. We don't need to wonder what the reaction to all this is in Moscow. Russia is making their objections loudly known to India, who is going ahead anyway. New Delhi has not intervened to stop the diversion of Indian weapons to Ukraine despite protests from Russia. It's been going on for over a year, and Moscow has formally complained at least twice. Here again, we see India's defense ministry insisting that India has not sent or sold any shells to Ukraine, but rather to buyers in Italy and the Czech Republic. 20 people were interviewed for this piece, including an Indian defense industry executive who says that India knows about the transfers but isn't doing anything about them. India is the biggest importer of weapons in the world, but sees the Ukraine war as an opportunity to build an arms export industry. Here are some of the numbers for that. In a 5-year period from 2018 through 2023, India exported $3 billion worth of arms. Last year, just 1 year, they did $2.5 billion, and they want to increase that to $6 billion by 2029. Here are the numbers on a company-wide basis. The 3 biggest Indian ammunition manufacturers exported $2.8 million in munitions to Europe in the 2 years preceding the war. In the 2 years right after, that increased to $135 million. An Italian company, MES, is the biggest foreign customer for Yantra, an Indian company, and MES says that they are just sending their shells onto Ukraine after filling them with explosives. Yantra and MES are now setting up manufacturing facilities for L-15A1 shells, which is a high explosive fragmentary shell for 155 millimeter artillery. This is another agreement between the Czech Republic and Munitions India, which shipped 10,000 rounds of artillery shells to Czech defense systems, and Kiev is the end user for many of those. It's at this point that China can enter the conversation because China's hard export ban on antimony is causing problems for everybody. Antimony is a critical component for high explosives, and China, Russia, and Tajikistan control the world's supply of antimony. This is the elephant in the room for NATO forces, for Ukraine, for weapons manufacturers, and all these Indian weapons makers who are looking to open big new markets for the bombs they build. They need China and Russia and Tajikistan to give them antimony to build those bombs. And it's this part that already has the Pentagon racing around trying to lock up supplies of antimony to replenish our own stocks. The U.S. Army had a goal of producing 100,000 artillery shells a month this year, 2025, but China's export ban on antimony is going to make that impossible. China announced export restrictions on antimony in September 2024, and as of 9 December, when this was written, shipments from China dropped 97% and prices tripled. In 2025, prices are surging even further. Mine production is dominated by China and Russia, says at the top of that chart, and we should expect that Russia and China figured out last year that they can put Indian arms manufacturers out of business just by keeping all their antimony for themselves. This is Wuxi, Jiangsu province. Be good.
Father, thank you for this precious brother who has come. Thank you for making him a man of integrity and honor and wisdom. Thank you for making him a brother. Empower him. Fill him with your Holy Spirit. Give him gifts